Imagine Africa announces it will not participate in the 2026 World Cup. And I don't mean one African team pulling out. I'm talking about the entire continent, comprising 54 nations, refusing to show up to the biggest sporting event on Earth. Now, your first instinct is probably to say that would never happen. And you might be right. But here is what is interesting. This conversation is already happening in real time. With the tournament already fast approaching, African fans are furious. African journalists are asking this question openly, and former FIFA president Sepp Blatter is on social media telling fans to stay away from the United States altogether. South Africa's opposition leader Julius Malema has publicly called on Bafana to withdraw, drawing comparisons to the apartheid-era sports boycotts of the 1970s. These are not fringe voices. These are named, credible people having a very serious conversation. And what most people get wrong is they assume the answer is simple. FIFA makes a call, someone backs down, and the tournament carries on as planned. But if you actually trace what happens next, legally, financially, politically, and for the players themselves, the answer is anything but simple. So let us go through it properly. First, you need to understand what Africa actually represents at this tournament, because the numbers are bigger than most people appreciate. Under the expanded 48-team format that FIFA introduced specifically to give more of the world a seat at the table, Africa was awarded 9 guaranteed group stage spots plus 1 additional place in the intercontinental playoffs. That is potentially 10 African nations at the tournament. The 9 who have already qualified are Algeria, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Senegal, South Africa, and Cape Verde. Remove all of them, and you have just deleted almost 20% of the entire competition. Not one group disrupted, but multiple groups simultaneously. Imagine showing up to a party and finding out a fifth of the guests left before you even walked through the door. And here is the historical context that makes this genuinely staggering. The modern World Cup has never lost an entire confederation. Not during the Cold War, not during the apartheid-era sports boycotts, not during any of the geopolitical earthquakes of the last 50 years. This would be historically unprecedented, which raises an obvious question. Would FIFA actually punish an entire continent for walking away? We will come back to that. But first, you need to understand what a boycott actually triggers, because it is not just a press conference. It is a legal mechanism. Here is something a lot of people do not appreciate about FIFA. It is not just a football organization. It is a regulatory body with binding rules. And those rules are built precisely for moments like this. Under FIFA disciplinary framework, every member association has a binding obligation to fulfill its scheduled matches. That is not a suggestion. It is the condition of membership. If you withdraw before a competition starts, the minimum fine is 20,000 Swiss francs per association. If you withdraw after the competition has already begun, say after your team has played 1 match, that minimum doubles to 40,000 Swiss francs. And those are just the floor figures, the starting point, not the ceiling. FIFA Disciplinary Committee can go significantly further. It can expel associations from future competitions, which means the nations involved could be locked out of the 2030 World Cup entirely. Associations lose their annual FIFA development funds, the money that pays for youth academies, women's football programs, and referee training across the continent. And they may be required to reimburse damages to broadcasters, sponsors, and the host nations themselves. Any scheduled matches that go unplayed, forfeited 3-0 to the opponent. On paper, that is an airtight enforcement system. But here is the tension underneath all of it. Could FIFA realistically enforce these rules against an entire confederation of 54 nations, all at once? Think about what that actually looks like in practice. FIFA would need to open 54 separate disciplinary cases simultaneously. It would need to suspend 54 associations at once. It would need to freeze development funding to an entire continent, which would be a reputational catastrophe of its own, punishing football development across Africa for a political decision made by federation officials. And it would need to do all of this without fracturing its own governance structure, because African nations hold one of the largest voting blocs in FIFA Congress. The rulebook says FIFA can do it, but politics and reality say it would be the messiest thing the organization has ever attempted. And that brings us to the money, because the 2026 World Cup is expected to be the most lucrative sporting event in history. FIFA projected revenue for the entire cycle is around $11 billion. Broadcasting rights alone are estimated at nearly $4 billion. Fox Sports and Telemundo in the United States paid roughly $1.25 billion just for American broadcast rights. Sponsorships from Adidas, Coca-Cola, Visa, and others add another $2.7 billion. Ticketing and hospitality, a record $3.1 billion. This is not just a tournament, it is a financial architecture built over years of contracts. Now, where does Africa fit into that architecture? Both directly and, more importantly, indirectly. Broadcasting deals in sub-Saharan Africa are priced on the assumption that African teams are playing. Pull those teams, and you pull the eyeballs. And the African diaspora in Europe and North America is enormous. Second-generation Senegalese in Paris, Ghanaians in London, Moroccans in Amsterdam. These are the fans who buy tickets, fill pubs, and drive viewership numbers in markets that FIFA sponsors are paying billions to reach. When Coca-Cola buys FIFA sponsorship rights, part of what it is purchasing is access to African and African diaspora consumer markets. A boycott shrinks that market, and nervous sponsors, when renewal time comes, ask very hard questions. There is also the reputational cost to the host nations. The United States, Canada, and Mexico spent years securing this tournament, expecting it to generate up to $30 billion in economic output for the US alone. A boycott driven by immigration and visa grievances against the United States specifically turns their global showcase into a geopolitical flashpoint. That is not the front page story any host city wants 4 months before opening day. But here is the twist. FIFA might actually survive this financially. The real damage is something the revenue spreadsheet cannot capture. It is called legitimacy. When 3.5 billion people watched the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, part of what made it feel like the world's tournament was that the world was genuinely there. Every corner, every style, every strip of color. Strip out an entire continent, and you have a very expensive, very well-attended, but fundamentally incomplete event. And that incompleteness is corrosive in ways that do not show up in the financial reports until long after the final whistle. And here is where we need to talk about what is actually driving this conversation, because the grievance is real and it is specific. In June 2025, President Trump signed a proclamation restricting entry for nationals from 19 countries, mostly from the Middle East and Africa. By December 2025, that list had expanded to 39 nations. 8 of Africa's 9 qualified World Cup teams are from countries affected by some version of these travel restrictions: Algeria, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Senegal, and Cape Verde. All appear on lists where fans face severe obstacles to obtaining US tourist visas. Athletes and official team delegations are exempt from the ban. The fans are not. Since 78 of the 104 World Cup matches take place in American cities, including both semifinals and the final, you end up with African teams that could play their entire knockout run in stadiums where their own supporters legally cannot sit. A Senegalese fan named Jibril Gay, speaking at the Africa Cup of Nations in Morocco in January 2026, put it plainly. I do not know why the American president would want teams from certain countries not to take part. If that is the case, they should not agree to host the World Cup. He said it plainly, and he was not alone. FIFA has been visibly uncomfortable. President Gianni Infantino attended Trump's inauguration, toured the Gulf with him in May 2025, and stood beside him in the Oval Office when Trump signed the executive order creating a White House task force for the 2026 World Cup. FIFA claim to political neutrality is getting harder to sell to the African football community with each passing month. Human Rights Watch wrote to FIFA directly, urging the organization to use its leverage to protect the rights of fans. FIFA launched a priority visa appointment system called the FIFA Pass, a genuine attempt at a workaround, but one that does not address fans from countries subject to full entry bans. This stops being a scheduling inconvenience. It becomes geopolitics, and when geopolitics enters the room, the African Union becomes relevant. If the O were to formally endorse or pressure a continental withdrawal, this would no longer be a sporting dispute at all. It would be a diplomatic incident between one of the world's largest geopolitical blocs and the host country of the biggest sporting event on Earth. No amount of FIFA press releases resolves that. So let us think through how this actually plays out, because there are 3 distinct scenarios, and each one is more complicated than the last. In the first scenario, CAF announces before the tournament begins that its 9 qualified nations are withdrawing collectively. This gives FIFA weeks, not days, to respond. FIFA moves fast, contacts the next best placed nations from other confederations, European playoff runners-up, South American fifth placers, Asian runners-up, and opens emergency spots. The tournament kicks off with 39 or 40 teams. Groups get redrawn. The ball rolls on June 11th, but every penalty in FIFA rulebook fires simultaneously across all 54 African federations. Fines, loss of prize money, expulsion threats for 2030, and the freezing of annual development funds. That last consequence lands hardest on the smallest federations, the ones that had nothing to do with the political decision, but absorb its financial fallout. And the players? Mohamed Salah does not play. Achraf Hakimi does not play. Sadio Mane does not play. The generation of African footballers who earned their spots through 2 years of qualification lose the World Cup they spent their prime years working toward. No policy reversal gives that back, but the consequences do not end there. In the second scenario, African teams play their opening group stage matches, and then, triggered by a specific incident, a high-profile visa denial, a confrontation at a border, an enforcement action near a stadium, the teams collectively announce they are going home mid-tournament. Now we are in genuinely chaotic territory. FIFA declares remaining scheduled matches as 3-0 forfeits. The group stage limps to an awkward conclusion. Broadcasting contracts trigger force majeure clause reviews. Sponsors activate penalty provisions. The reimbursement demands from broadcasters and sponsors land on CAF's desk, demands that could cripple smaller African football federations for a decade. And the teams that advance to the knockout rounds do so with asterisks hanging over them forever. The eventual champion of a World Cup missing 9 African nations has a legitimacy problem no trophy can fix. But even this is not the strangest version of events. The third scenario is a partial boycott where 5 African nations withdraw and 4 stay, or 6 and 3, with no unified position, just a fracture. Some federations deciding the political statement is worth the sacrifice, others deciding their players' World Cup dreams take priority. FIFA uses the departing nations' withdrawals to escalate discipline against them, specifically while quietly celebrating that it still has African representation at all. But the remaining African teams compete under a persistent cloud, pulled in 2 directions at once, pressured by FIFA to endorse the tournament's inclusivity and called sellouts by members of their own diaspora. No trophy at the end of it fully resolves the contradiction. Now the question everyone wants answered: does the tournament collapse? No. The 2026 World Cup does not get cancelled. The broadcasting contracts alone, nearly $4 billion worth of them signed years in advance, make cancellation financially catastrophic for FIFA in ways that dwarf even the worst boycott scenario. The infrastructure is locked in. The host cities have spent billions. The tournament happens. Replacement teams almost certainly fill the vacated spots. It would be messy and widely criticized, but it would happen. Kickoff is June 11th. That date does not move. And yet, a World Cup without Africa's 9 nations is a World Cup without Mohamed Salah, Achraf Hakimi, and the team that reached the semi-finals in Qatar, the furthest any African nation has ever gone in this tournament's history. It is a World Cup without 1 billion fans watching from the continent, with the world's youngest and fastest growing population. The empty seats in African fan sections. The silence where Senegal's drummers would be. Morocco's green and red sea of supporters, absent. These are not aesthetic losses you can replace with a different flag in the stands. They are the tournament's soul, and you cannot insure against losing the soul of an event. But would it still feel like a World Cup? That is the question nobody in FIFA boardroom wants to answer out loud. Zoom out past the tournament and look at the structures underneath it, and something more fundamental comes into focus. Africa holds the largest single voting bloc in FIFA Congress. Its 54 member associations, if genuinely aligned, can influence FIFA presidential elections, host country selections, and the distribution of the sport's revenues. A boycott driven by justifiable and documented grievances gives that bloc a level of moral authority within the global football community that it has rarely held. That is real leverage, and every confederation watching would take note. In the aftermath of a boycott, the questions become impossible to sidestep. How did FIFA award a World Cup to a nation that then imposed travel bans on the fans of qualifying teams? What does FIFA political neutrality actually mean? And who does it protect in practice? Future host nation selection would never look the same. Every future host bid would face forensic examination of its immigration policies, its track record on the free movement of international visitors. That is actually a healthy development for the sport, but it would be born from a genuinely painful moment, and perhaps most significantly, a successful boycott, or even a near boycott that extracts real concessions, establishes the playbook for every other confederation in every future dispute. It demonstrates that collective withdrawal is a real card on the table. FIFA has spent decades managing the power balance among its confederations. A continental boycott that works changes that balance permanently. So here is the honest, layered answer to the question we started with. FIFA survives. The institution is too deeply entrenched in contracts and global football infrastructure to be broken by even a full continental withdrawal. Africa faces real penalties. The fines, the expulsion threats, the loss of development funds land on federations that can least afford them, and they land hardest on the players and programs that never chose this fight. The players suffer most immediately, losing a World Cup at their peak with no way to get it back. Legitimacy takes the deepest wound. FIFA revenue survives a boycott. Its story does not. And the global power balance shifts because however this standoff resolves, the fact that it became a serious conversation with serious people attached to it changes what every future negotiation looks like. The World Cup calls itself global. A boycott tests whether it truly is.